The hospital waiting room was almost empty at 2 in the morning. Just a few scattered souls sitting in those uncomfortable plastic chairs, each lost in their own private worry. David sat in the corner, his third cup of coffee growing cold between his hands. He couldn't drink it. He couldn't do much of anything except stare at the double doors where they'd wheeled his wife away 3 hours ago. The coffee machine hummed in the background. Someone's phone buzzed. A nurse walked past with quiet, practiced steps. Normal sounds in a moment that felt anything but normal. His phone sat face down on the chair beside him. He'd turned it off after the 5th call from work. Even now, even here, they wanted something from him. There was always another deadline, another crisis, another meeting that absolutely couldn't happen without him. For months, maybe years, he'd believed that. He'd worn his exhaustion like a badge of honor, proof that he was important, necessary, successful. Tonight, none of that mattered. Jennifer was in surgery because of a car accident, a simple drive home from her sister's place, a route she'd driven 1,000 times. But tonight, a truck ran a red light. Tonight, everything changed in an instant. Their daughter Sophie was safe at his mother's house, probably asleep by now, unaware that her world had tilted on its axis. David's hands were shaking. He pressed them against his knees, trying to steady himself, trying to hold something together when everything felt like it was falling apart. The thing was, it had been falling apart for a long time. He just hadn't been paying attention. The truth sat heavy in his chest. Jennifer had been at her sister's house for a reason. She'd gone there to talk, to cry, to tell someone how lonely she felt. His mother had mentioned it when she picked up Sophie, her voice careful but pointed. "Your wife needs you," she'd said. "Not your paycheck, you." He'd been too busy to notice, too busy to see that his wife had stopped trying to talk to him about her day, too busy to realize that Sophie had stopped asking him to read bedtime stories because he always said, "Maybe tomorrow." Too busy climbing a ladder that led nowhere he actually wanted to go. The waiting room felt too bright, too quiet, too full of empty space where his thoughts echoed too loud. He kept replaying the phone call from the hospital, the calm, professional voice telling him there'd been an accident. The way his entire body went cold. The drive here, running red lights himself, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. And underneath all that fear, underneath the terror of losing Jennifer, was another feeling. Shame. Deep, burning shame that it took this. Took her lying on an operating table, for him to finally wake up to what he'd been doing, or rather what he hadn't been doing. He'd been absent. Present in body but gone in every way that mattered. He'd sit at the dinner table scrolling through emails. He'd miss Sophie's school plays because of last-minute meetings. He'd fall asleep on the couch instead of going to bed with Jennifer, too drained from giving everything to strangers who paid him to be there. When had he become this person? When had he traded his real life for this hollow version of success? The double doors opened and David's heart jumped, but it was just another nurse passing through. Not his turn yet. Not time for news yet. Just more waiting, more sitting with thoughts he'd been running from for too long. He noticed someone else in the waiting room then, an older man sitting a few chairs away. He looked to be in his 70s, wearing a faded work jacket and jeans that had seen better days. His weathered hands rested on his knees and his eyes held the kind of tired that comes from years, not just hours. The man glanced over, caught David's eye and gave a small nod. Not pitying, not intrusive, just acknowledgement. One worried person to another. David nodded back. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just two people existing in the same difficult moment, not needing to fill it with empty words. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe 20. Time felt strange here, elastic and unreliable. David found himself thinking about the morning, just yesterday morning, when Jennifer had asked him if he could take a day off next week. Just one day to go somewhere together. Maybe drive to the lake they used to visit. He'd said he'd check his calendar, which they both knew meant no. She'd smiled, but it hadn't reached her eyes. It never did anymore. Rough night? The older man's voice was gentle, not demanding an answer, just offering an opening if David needed one. David let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "My wife, surgery, car accident." The man nodded slowly. "I'm sorry. That's a heavy weight to carry." Something about the way he said it without platitudes or false reassurance made David's throat tighten. "I should have been there." Were you driving the other car? No, but David's voice cracked. He didn't know this stranger. Had no reason to bare his soul to him, but something broke loose anyway. I should have been a better husband. Should have been home more. Should have listened when she tried to talk. I was always too tired, too busy, too focused on work that seemed so important until right now, when none of it matters at all. The words tumbled out. Months of guilt and realization pouring into the fluorescent lit waiting room. He told this stranger things he'd barely admitted to himself. How he'd missed Sophie's 6th birthday party for a conference call. How he'd forgotten his anniversary until Jennifer mentioned it, and even then he'd just ordered flowers online between meetings. How his wife had stopped saying I love you at the end of phone calls because he was always too distracted to say it back. The older man listened. Really listened, not with the impatience of someone waiting for their turn to talk, but with the full attention David had forgotten people could give. When David finally ran out of words, wrung out and empty, the man just sat there for a moment, letting the confession settle. Takes courage to admit that, the man said finally. Most folks won't. What good is admitting it now? David's voice was bitter. When she's in there and I'm out here and everything's already broken. The older man looked at him with eyes that held something David couldn't quite name. Sadness, maybe. Understanding. Something deeper than sympathy. Now's when it counts most. When everything breaks is when you find out what you're made of. Whether you're going to keep hiding from it or whether you're going to face it. David wanted to ask what he meant, but a nurse appeared at the double doors, looking around the room. His heart stopped. But she walked over to the older man instead, speaking quietly. The man stood slowly, joints creaking, and followed her through the doors. David was alone again with his cold coffee and his churning thoughts. But something had shifted. Talking to that stranger, admitting the truth out loud, had cracked something open inside him. He felt raw, exposed, but also more awake than he'd been in years. He thought about Sophie, probably curled up in his mother's guest bed, hugging her stuffed rabbit. He thought about Jennifer in surgery, fighting to come back. And he thought about the man he'd been, the absent father and checked-out husband, and wondered if it was too late to become someone different. The clock on the wall ticked toward 3 a.m. The night stretched on, heavy with uncertainty and the weight of everything he'd finally allowed himself to see. David sat in that uncomfortable plastic chair and waited, not just for news about Jennifer, but for the chance to be the person his family deserved. If he got that chance. If it wasn't too late, please, he thought, not quite a prayer, but close. Please let me have the chance to do better, to be better, to show up for the people who matter, before there's no one left to show up for. The waiting room hummed its quiet mechanical sounds, and David waited finally, painfully awake. The older man came back through the double doors about 20 minutes later. His shoulders sagged a bit more than before, but there was a hint of relief in his face. He settled back into his chair with a heavy sigh, the kind that comes from worry being lifted even just a little. David couldn't help himself. Everything okay? For now, the man replied, his voice tired but grateful. My daughter's stable. Pneumonia hit her hard, but she's fighting through it. They're keeping her another night for observation. That's good. That she's stable, I mean. The man nodded, then looked over at David. No news yet about your wife? Not yet. David checked his watch. Almost 4 hours now. Each minute felt like it lasted forever. Mind if I keep you company while we wait? Sometimes sitting alone with your thoughts isn't the best thing. David actually felt relief at the offer. His own thoughts had been eating him alive for hours. I'd appreciate that. Actually, the man stood up, joints popping, and moved to the chair next to David. Up close, David could see the lines on his face. Years of sun and hard work carved into weathered skin. His hands were rough, scarred with old injuries from what looked like a lifetime of manual labor. Name's Robert, the man said, extending one of those rough hands. David. They shook, and then sat in companionable silence for a moment. Robert pulled out a worn wallet from his jacket pocket and extracted a photograph, its edges soft from years of handling. He looked at it with a small, sad smile, then passed it to David. The photo showed a wedding. A young man in a tux standing next to a beautiful bride, both of them beaming. Behind them stood an older couple. The groom looked a lot like Robert, and the older man in the photo was definitely a younger version of him. Your son? David asked. Yeah, that was 5 years ago. Beautiful wedding. Robert's voice held warmth, but also something else, something heavier. Took us a long time to get there, though. Almost didn't happen. David handed back the photo, sensing there was more to the story. Robert tucked it carefully back into his wallet. You remind me of myself about 30 years back. That thing you said earlier, about being too busy, too tired, too focused on work. I lived that life. Thought I was doing right by my family, you know? Working hard, bringing home a paycheck, providing. Thought that was what being a man meant. What being a father meant. He paused, his eyes distant, seeing something from decades ago. I worked construction. Long hours, hard work, but honest work. I'd leave before my kids woke up and get home after they were asleep. Weekends, I was too exhausted to do anything but watch TV and drink beer. My wife tried to tell me, tried so many times to get through to me, but I was stubborn. Thought she didn't understand what it took to keep a roof over our heads. David felt his chest tighten. This was his story, told by someone else. I had 2 kids, a daughter and a son. My daughter, that's who I'm here for tonight. She was the easy one. Did well in school, stayed out of trouble, didn't make waves. My son, though, Robert's voice caught slightly. He was different. Sensitive kid. Needed more attention, more time, more of me than I was willing to give. What happened? David asked quietly. Robert took a deep breath. He was 16. Seemed fine on the surface. Quiet but fine. Got decent grades, didn't cause problems. Then one Tuesday afternoon, my wife found him in the garage. He'd tried to hang himself. The words hit David like a physical blow. He couldn't speak. Thank God she came home early that day. Thank God she found him when she did. The doctor said another few minutes, and Robert's hands trembled slightly as he rubbed his face. That was my wake-up call. That was when I finally understood what I'd done, what I'd failed to do. The waiting room felt even quieter now, if that was possible. Somewhere down the hall, a machine beeped steadily, normal life continuing while Robert shared this piece of his broken past. Why did he do it? David asked, though he almost didn't want to know the answer. Because he felt invisible. Because in our house he was invisible. I was never there, and when I was too tired or too checked out to notice him. His sister got praised for her grades, but nobody noticed that he was struggling. Nobody saw that he was drowning in loneliness and depression. He told the therapist later that he felt like he could disappear and nobody would care. Could you imagine? Your own kid feeling like that? Robert's eyes were wet now. Years of guilt still fresh despite the time that had passed. I thought I was being a good father by working hard. Turns out I was just being absent. There's a difference, and I learned it too late. Almost too late. David felt his own eyes burning. This was his fear, his nightmare, spoken out loud by someone who'd lived it. How did you fix it? Did you fix it? It took years, Robert said honestly. Years of therapy, family counseling, rebuilding trust brick by brick. I had to completely change who I was. Had to learn that being a father wasn't about how much money I made or how hard I worked. It was about showing up. Actually being present when I was there. Listening when my kids talked. Caring about their lives, not just providing for them. Did he forgive you? Robert smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. Eventually. But I had to earn it. And I had to forgive myself too, which was harder. See that photo I showed you? My son is a counselor now. Works with teenagers who are struggling, kids like he was. He took his pain and turned it into purpose. I'm so proud of him I could burst. But I also carry the weight of knowing I almost lost him. That I was the reason he got to that dark place. How did you change? David needed to know. Needed to understand how someone could transform like that. First, I had to admit I had a problem. That was the hardest part. Guys like us were good at denying things, pushing feelings down, acting like everything's fine. I had to stop doing that. Had to look in the mirror and see who I'd really become. Robert shifted in his chair, his old bones creaking. Then I had to make choices. Hard choices. I cut my hours at work. Took a pay cut to get better shifts. My boss thought I was crazy. Some of my coworkers thought I was weak, but my family needed me more than they needed another dollar in the bank. Wasn't that scary? The money part? Terrifying, Robert admitted. We had to move to a smaller house. Couldn't afford some things we used to. But you know what? Nobody cared. My kids didn't want a bigger house. They wanted a father who knew their friends' names, who showed up to their school events, who asked about their day and actually listened to the answer. David thought about his own house, the big one in the nice neighborhood that he'd bought to prove he'd made it. Jennifer had liked it at first, but lately she'd mentioned how empty it felt. How much work it was to maintain. How she missed their old apartment sometimes when they were younger and broke but together. I started having dinner with my family every night. Robert continued. Sounds simple, right? But it changed everything. We'd sit around the table and talk. Really talk. I learned about my son's love for drawing, my daughter's dreams of becoming a teacher, my wife's feelings about everything that had happened. I learned who my family actually was instead of who I assumed they were. And your son got better? Slowly, with therapy and medication and time and love. Lots of love. But yeah, he got better. He learned to trust again, to believe that someone cared about whether he lived or died. And I learned to be the father he needed, not just the provider I thought I had to be. Robert pulled out his phone, an older model but functional, and scrolled through some photos. He showed David a recent one. A family gathering, lots of people smiling. Robert pointed to a man in his 40s with kind eyes. That's him now. That's my son. He's got 2 kids of his own. And you know what he told me last year? He said I was a great grandfather. Said his kids love me. That meant more than anything else in my life. David stared at the photo, seeing hope in it. Proof that people could change. That damage could be repaired. Why are you telling me all this? David asked. You don't even know me. Robert looked at him directly, his old eyes sharp and clear. Because I see myself in you. I see a man who's about to lose everything that matters while chasing things that don't. I see someone standing where I stood 30 years ago, and I'm telling you now what I wish someone had told me then. You've still got time. You've still got a chance. Don't waste it like I almost did. The words settled over David like a weight and a promise all at once. Before he could respond, a doctor appeared at the double doors, this time looking directly at him. David's heart lurched into his throat. Family of Jennifer Parker? David stood so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. This was it. This was the moment that would determine everything. He looked back at Robert, who gave him a firm nod of encouragement. Then David walked toward the doctor, toward the truth, toward whatever came next. The doctor was a woman in her 50s with tired but kind eyes. She pulled down her surgical mask as David approached, and he tried to read her expression, searching desperately for good news or bad news, anything to end the not knowing. Your wife came through surgery well, she said, and David felt his knees almost give out from relief. We had to repair some internal bleeding and set her broken arm and leg, but she's stable now. She's in recovery. Can I see her? The words tumbled out. Please, I need to see her. In a little while. She's still unconscious from the anesthesia. We'll come get you when she's ready. The next few days will be critical for her recovery. But she's a fighter. She's going to need a lot of support, a lot of care. It'll be a long road. I'll be here, David said, meaning it more deeply than he'd ever meant anything. Whatever she needs, I'll be here. The doctor smiled slightly, nodded, and disappeared back through the doors. David stood there for a moment, letting the news sink in. Jennifer was alive. She'd made it through. He still had a chance. They still had a chance. He turned back to Robert, who was standing now, a small smile on his weathered face. That's good news, son. Real good news. Thank you, David said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was thanking him for. The company, maybe. The story. The hope. Remember what I said. This is your wake-up call. Don't hit snooze on it. David nodded, shook Robert's hand one more time, then watched as the older man headed back toward his daughter's room. He was alone in the waiting room again, but he felt different now, like something fundamental had shifted inside him. He caught sight of his reflection in the dark window that looked out onto the hospital parking lot. Dawn was starting to break, the sky turning from black to deep blue. In that window, he saw himself clearly for maybe the first time in years. He looked terrible. Exhausted, hollow-eyed, his shirt wrinkled from hours in a plastic chair. But more than that, he saw who he'd become. A ghost of a husband, a phantom father, someone who existed in the same space as his family but wasn't really there. When had that happened? When had he traded being present for being productive? When had he decided that his worth was measured in promotions and paychecks instead of bedtime stories and family dinners? He thought about Sophie, only 7 years old. She'd started doing this thing lately where she'd ask if he was really home before she told him about her day. She'd learned to check whether he was listening or just pretending. A 7-year-old shouldn't have to do that. Shouldn't have to wonder if her father cared about her day at school. And Jennifer. God, Jennifer. She'd been trying to tell him for months. Maybe years. Those quiet comments about how they never talked anymore. The suggestions about taking a weekend trip together. The way she'd stopped asking him to help with dinner because he always said he had work to finish. She'd been waving red flags and he'd been too busy looking at his laptop screen to notice. The worst part was, he'd told himself he was doing it for them. Every extra hour at work, every missed event, every time he chose his career over his family, he'd justified it by saying he was providing for them, building a better future, making sure they had everything they needed, but what they needed was him. Just him. Not his money or his ambitions or his excuses, just the man they'd fallen in love with. The father who used to play pretend and read stories and notice things. David pulled out his phone and turned it back on. Immediately it buzzed with missed calls and messages. His boss, his team, people demanding to know where he was and why he hadn't responded. There was a time just yesterday when these messages would have sent him into a panic, when he would have felt guilty for not being available, for not putting work first. Now they just looked empty, meaningless. A bunch of strangers asking for pieces of him while his actual family lay broken. He opened his text messages and found one from his mother, sent hours ago. "Sophie keeps asking for you. I told her you're with Mommy at the hospital. She's scared but trying to be brave. Come get her when you can. She needs her daddy. She needs her daddy." Such simple words, but they cracked something wide open in David's chest. When was the last time he'd really been what Sophie needed? When had he last put her first ahead of a meeting or a deadline or his own exhaustion? He scrolled back through his text history with Jennifer. The last few weeks were mostly logistics. "Can you pick up Sophie? Don't forget the parent-teacher conference. I'll be late again tonight." When had they stopped saying, "I love you"? When had their conversations become nothing but schedules and obligations? He found a message from 3 months ago late at night. Jennifer had written, "I miss you even when you're home. I miss us." He'd read it the next morning between meetings and had meant to respond, meant to really talk about it, but then something came up. There was always something coming up, and now he couldn't remember if he'd ever responded at all. A nurse brought him a cup of coffee, fresh and hot, not the stale stuff from the machine. "You can see your wife in about 30 minutes, she said gently. "She's starting to wake up. Just family in the ICU, and only for short visits at first. Thank you." David wrapped his hands around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into his cold fingers. 30 minutes. He had 30 minutes to figure out what to say to her. How do you apologize for years of absence in a few minutes? How do you promise to change when you've broken so many promises before? Robert's story kept playing in his mind. The son who'd felt invisible. The father who'd almost lost everything before he woke up. The years it took to rebuild. David thought about his own wake-up call. The truck that ran a red light and sent his wife to surgery. Was that what it took? Did people have to nearly die before you paid attention to them? He couldn't change the past. Couldn't take back the missed moments, the times he'd chosen wrong, the slowly accumulating distance between him and the people he loved. But maybe if he was very lucky, if Jennifer gave him the chance, he could change what came next. The sky outside was getting lighter. Saturday morning now. In his old life, the life from yesterday, he'd probably be getting ready for work anyway. He used to go in on Saturdays telling himself it was necessary, that he'd make it up to his family later. There was always a later that never came. David made a decision, right there in that waiting room at dawn. A real decision, not just a feeling or a good intention. He pulled up his work email and started typing. His hands didn't shake. His mind was clear. He wrote to his boss that he was taking family medical leave, effective immediately, that his wife was in the hospital and would need months of recovery, that he wouldn't be available for calls or emails, that they'd need to redistribute his projects because he wouldn't be returning to the same schedule he'd kept before. He didn't apologize, didn't over-explain, just stated the facts and sent it before he could second-guess himself. The moment he hit send, he felt something lift off his shoulders, fear maybe, or the weight of trying to be someone he didn't want to be anymore. His phone immediately rang, his boss. David looked at the name on the screen, then silenced the call. It rang again. He silenced it again. After the third attempt, he turned off his phone completely. For the first time in years, work couldn't reach him. And instead of panic, he felt relief. Deep, overwhelming relief. Family for Jennifer Parker? A different nurse stood at the double doors. "You can see her now. Room 412 in the ICU, just 15 minutes this visit." David stood, leaving his cold coffee behind. His heart was pounding, but different than before. Not with fear of loss, but with hope. Hope that it wasn't too late. Hope that she'd give him another chance. Hope that he could become the man she deserved, the father Sophie needed. He followed the nurse through the double doors, down a long hallway with fluorescent lights and that distinct hospital smell. Each step felt significant, like he was walking toward his real life, the one he'd been hiding from. Room 412. The nurse pushed open the door gently. Just 15 minutes, she reminded him. David stepped inside and saw Jennifer lying in the hospital bed, tubes and monitors surrounding her, her left arm in a cast, her face pale but peaceful. Her eyes were closed, but as he approached, they fluttered open. "David," she whispered, her voice rough from the breathing tube they'd removed. "I'm here," he said, taking her good hand carefully in both of his. "I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere. Not anymore." She looked at him with eyes that held pain and confusion and something else, something that might have been hope. "Promise?" she asked, like she was afraid to believe him. "I promise," he said. "On everything that matters, I promise." And this time he meant it. This time he'd do whatever it took to keep that promise. Because he'd looked in the mirror and seen the truth. And the truth was, nothing he could achieve at work would ever matter as much as this moment, this woman, this family. He'd almost had to lose everything to understand that. But maybe, just maybe, he'd woken up in time. The first week was the hardest. Not because of the physical demands, though those were real enough, but because David had to face what he'd become and actively choose to be someone different. Every single day, every single hour, Jennifer came home from the hospital on a Thursday afternoon. David had spent the previous days transforming their bedroom into something manageable for her. He'd moved furniture, set up a small table for her medications, bought a walker and a special cushion for the chair by the window. His mother helped, showing him how to organize things so Jennifer wouldn't have to reach or strain. Sophie watched all of this with big, uncertain eyes. She'd visited the hospital twice, and both times had been scared by how fragile her mother looked. Now, as they helped Jennifer into the house, Sophie hung back, her little fingers twisted in the hem of her shirt. "Come here, baby," Jennifer said from her wheelchair, her voice still weak but warm. "I missed you so much." Sophie ran to her then, careful not to bump the cast, and buried her face in her mother's lap. "Are you going to be okay, Mommy?" "I'm going to be fine," Jennifer promised, stroking Sophie's hair. "It'll just take some time." What she didn't say, what David saw in her eyes when she looked at him, was the bigger question. Were they going to be okay? The marriage, the family, everything that had been breaking long before the accident? That was going to take more than time. That was going to take work. His boss called 3 times that first day. David didn't answer. By the second day, his coworkers started texting. Some were supportive, others less so. One guy from his team wrote, "Man, we're drowning here. When are you coming back?" David deleted the message and didn't respond. On day 3, his boss showed up at the house. David was in the kitchen trying to figure out how to make lunch. He'd burned the grilled cheese, somehow managed to oversalt the soup, and was staring at both disasters when the doorbell rang. His boss stood on the porch in his expensive suit, looking uncomfortable and out of place. "David, we need to talk." "I'm on family leave," David said, not moving from the doorway. "I know, but this is important. The Henderson account is falling apart. You're the only one who knows the client well enough to salvage it. Just a few phone calls, maybe one meeting. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't critical." A month ago, David would have said yes, would have felt important, needed, irreplaceable. Now he just felt tired. "I told you I'm not available." "This is your career we're talking about," his boss pressed. "You've worked too hard to throw it away. The Henderson account could make or break your promotion." "Don't you care about that?" David looked past him to where his car sat in the driveway. The car he'd driven to the hospital that terrible night. The car he'd been sitting in, taking a work call when he got the news about Jennifer's accident. He'd been choosing his career over his family for years. And what had it gotten him? An almost destroyed marriage, a daughter who barely knew him, and a wife in a hospital bed. "No," he said simply. "I don't care about that anymore. My family needs me here. That's what matters." His boss stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "You're making a mistake. When you decide to come back to reality, we'll talk about whether there's still a position for you." He turned and walked back to his car, shoulders stiff with disapproval. David closed the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding. He'd just potentially destroyed his career. The career he'd sacrificed everything for. And instead of panic, he felt something else, relief, maybe even pride. Was that your boss? Jennifer called from the bedroom. David walked in to find her sitting up, looking concerned. Yeah, what did he want? Me to come back to work. I said no. Jennifer studied his face, searching for something. Are you sure? I know your job is important to you. It was, David said, sitting on the edge of the bed carefully. But it's not more important than this, than you, than Sophie, than actually being a father and a husband instead of just someone who sleeps here sometimes. She was quiet for a long moment. It's going to be a long recovery, David, months. I can't walk on my own yet. Can't do basic things. It's going to be hard. I know. And even after I heal physically, we've got a lot to work through. You can't just show up for a few weeks and think everything's fixed. I know that too. David took her hand. I'm not looking for quick fixes. I'm looking to actually change. To be different. I know I've got years of making up to do. Years of showing you that I mean it this time. Her eyes filled with tears. I want to believe you, I do. But you've made promises before, I know. And I broke them. Every time work called, every time I said I was too tired. Every time I chose something else over you and Sophie. I broke those promises and I can't take that back. All I can do is show you, starting now, starting today, that I'm different. The days that followed tested that promise in every possible way. Taking care of someone recovering from major surgery was exhausting. Jennifer needed help with everything. Getting to the bathroom, getting dressed, taking medications on schedule, doing physical therapy exercises. David learned to manage pain medications, wound care, and how to help her move without hurting her. But harder than the physical care was the emotional weight. Jennifer was frustrated by her helplessness. She'd always been independent, capable, the one who kept the household running. Now she couldn't even make herself a sandwich. She cried sometimes from the pain, from the frustration, from the overwhelming feeling of being dependent. David learned to sit with her during those moments, not trying to fix it or minimize it, just being there, holding her hand, letting her cry. It was harder than any project at work had ever been because he couldn't solve it. He could only endure it with her. Sophie struggled too. She was scared of hurting her mother, scared of the changes in their house, scared that things would never be normal again. She had nightmares and started wetting the bed, something she hadn't done in years. David started a new bedtime routine. Every night he'd read to Sophie, then they'd talk about their day. Really talk, not just the surface stuff. He learned about her best friend's birthday party drama, her frustration with math homework, her worry that kids at school would tease her about her mom's accident. Daddy? Sophie asked one night as he was tucking her in. Are you going to leave again? The question hit him like a punch. What do you mean, sweetheart? Before you were always gone. Even when you were here, you were on your computer or your phone. Are you going to go back to that? David pulled her close, this little girl who'd learned to expect disappointment from him. No, baby. I'm not going back to that. I'm here now and I'm staying here. But what about work? Work is just work. You and Mommy are my family. That's more important. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Jimmy's dad left. After his parents fought a lot, he doesn't live there anymore, so that was it. That was the fear underneath. David's throat tightened. I'm not leaving. Not the house, not you, not Mommy. I'm staying and I'm going to be here. Really here. I promise. She looked at him with those big, serious eyes. Okay, but if you break your promise, I'm going to be really, really mad at you. That's fair, David said, kissing her forehead. That's completely fair. He started cooking. Badly at first. He burned things, undercooked things, forgot ingredients, created disasters that Sophie declared not eatable. But he kept trying. His mother came over and taught him basic meals. Jennifer walked him through recipes from the bedroom, patient even when he messed up. Slowly, very slowly, he got better. Not good, but functional. Sophie started requesting specific meals, which felt like progress. And on the nights when he really screwed up, they'd order pizza and laugh about his failures instead of him working late while they ate alone. David also started going to therapy. This was the hardest part to admit he needed, but Robert's words kept echoing in his head. He had to change from the inside out, not just change his schedule. The therapist, an older woman named Dr. Patterson, didn't let him off easy. She made him confront why he'd become so obsessed with work. They talked about his own father, who'd measured David's worth in achievements. They talked about his fear of failure, his need to prove himself, his belief that he wasn't enough just as he was. "You've been running from something," Dr. Patterson said during one session. "The question is, what are you running toward now?" That question stuck with him. For years, he'd been running toward success, toward achievement, toward some finish line that kept moving further away. Now he was running toward something different, toward being present, toward being known by his family and knowing them, toward a life that felt real instead of hollow. 6 weeks after the accident, David and Jennifer started couples counseling. They sat in uncomfortable chairs and talked about hard things, about loneliness and resentment and disappointment, about the slow death of their connection, about whether it could be rebuilt. "Do you still love him?" the counselor asked Jennifer during their third session. Jennifer looked at David for a long moment. "I love who he was, who we were together before all this. I don't know if I love who he became, and I don't know yet if the person he's being now is real or temporary." It hurt to hear, but David understood. He'd earned that doubt. "All I can do is show you," he said. "Every day, for however long it takes." Some days were better than others. Some days Jennifer smiled at him and it felt like hope. Other days she was distant, protecting herself from getting hurt again. David learned to accept both, to not pressure her for forgiveness before she was ready. His company sent him termination papers. They'd filled his position, moved on without him. A few months ago, this would have devastated him. Now he just signed them and filed them away. He'd find another job eventually, one with better boundaries. But that wasn't the priority now. Sophie started calling him present daddy after his mother explained the concept to her. "You used to be work daddy," Sophie explained seriously. "But now you're present daddy. Because you're here and you pay attention." It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement, progress. He'd take it. 3 months after the accident, David found himself back in the same hospital waiting room. Not for Jennifer this time, but for Robert. The older man's daughter had developed complications from her pneumonia, and when David called to check in, Robert mentioned he'd be spending the day at the hospital. David brought coffee. Real coffee from the good place downtown, not the machine stuff. When he walked into the waiting room, he found Robert looking smaller than he remembered, more tired. But the old man's face lit up when he saw David. "You came," Robert said, his voice warm with surprise. "Of course I came. You sat with me on the worst night of my life. Least I can do is return the favor." They sat together and David told him everything. The surgery, the recovery, the family leave, losing his job, the therapy, the counseling, the slow, painful work of rebuilding. Sophie's nickname for him, Jennifer's cautious hope mixed with understandable doubt. "Sounds like you're doing the work," Robert said, nodding with approval. "The real work, not the easy stuff." "Some days I don't know if it's enough," David admitted. "Some days Jennifer looks at me like she's waiting for me to go back to who I was. Like she doesn't trust this version of me. Can you blame her?" "No, not at all. I broke her trust over and over. She'd be stupid to just hand it back." Robert smiled. "That's good, that you understand that. Most men get mad when their wives don't just forgive and forget. But trust is like a vase, you know? Once it's broken, even if you glue it back together, the cracks are still there. Takes time before you can pour anything into it again without worrying it'll leak." They sat quietly for a moment. Then David asked, "Does it ever stop?" "The guilt? About what I almost lost? About who I was?" Robert shook his head slowly. "No, but it changes. Becomes less sharp. Turns into something you can use, something that keeps you honest. My guilt reminds me why I changed. Keeps me from slipping back. I'm scared," David confessed. "Scared that once things get normal again, I'll forget. I'll slip back into old habits. That's why you don't let things get normal again. You build a new normal. One where your family comes first, and that's not negotiable. You build a life that reflects what actually matters, not what you thought mattered." A nurse came through then, motioning to Robert. "Your daughter's awake and asking for you." Robert stood, then paused. "Come meet her, if you don't mind." David followed him through those familiar double doors, down hallways he remembered from his own awful night. Robert's daughter was in her 40s, pale but smiling. A younger version of Robert sat in a chair by her bed, his hand holding hers. "Kelly, this is David," Robert introduced. "The young man I told you about." Kelly smiled weakly. "The one from that night. Dad said you reminded him of himself." "That's not exactly a compliment," David said, and Kelly laughed softly. "No, but look at you both now. Dad said you took his advice." "I'm trying." The man in the chair stood and extended his hand. David recognized him from the wedding photo. Robert's son. "I'm Jack," he said. "Dad talks about you. Says you actually listened." There was something in Jack's eyes, a depth of understanding that only comes from living through darkness. This was the boy who'd almost died, who'd felt invisible in his own home. Now a grown man, a counselor, a father himself. "I listened because your dad's story terrified me," David said honestly. "The idea that I could lose everything while thinking I was doing the right thing. That woke me up." "Good," Jack said simply. "That fear is healthy. It means you get it." They talked for a while, the four of them. Robert shared more about those difficult years of rebuilding. Jack talked about his work with teenagers, how he could spot the signs of neglect and depression because he'd lived them, how he used his own story to reach kids who felt invisible. "The thing is," Jack said, "my dad wasn't a bad person. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He just didn't know. Didn't understand that working hard wasn't the same as being present. Once he got it, once he really understood, he changed. Not everyone does that. Not everyone is brave enough to admit they were wrong." David thought about his own journey. The night in the waiting room when everything cracked open. The decision to take leave. The therapy, the hard conversations, the daily choice to be different. It was brave, he realized. Not in the loud, obvious way, but in the quiet, persistent way of choosing difficulty over comfort. "How's your daughter handling all this?" Kelly asked. "Kids are perceptive. She must know things were bad. She does. She's cautious with me. Tests whether I'm really going to stay, really going to be present. I don't blame her. I've got to earn her trust back, same as with my wife." "You will," Robert said with certainty, "as long as you keep showing up. Kids are resilient. They forgive easier than adults as long as they see real change." David stayed for another hour, then headed home. As he drove, he thought about the strange gift Robert had given him. Not advice, not solutions, but a mirror. By sharing his own failures and redemption, Robert had shown David what his life could become if he didn't change. And also what it could become if he did. When David got home, Jennifer was in the living room with her physical therapist working on walking exercises. She was using a cane now instead of the walker. Slow progress, but progress nonetheless. Sophie sat on the couch doing homework, glancing up occasionally to watch her mother with worried eyes. "How's Robert's daughter?" Jennifer asked when the therapist left. "Better. Might go home in a few days." David set his keys down. "I met his son. The one he told me about." Jennifer knew the story. David had shared it with her one night when she asked why he'd changed so suddenly, so completely. She'd cried when he told her about Robert's son, about the garage, about how close they'd come to tragedy. And he's amazing. Works with kids now, helps them. Took his pain and turned it into purpose. He and Robert are close. You can see it, the work they put into rebuilding. "That's what we're doing," Jennifer said softly. "Rebuilding." "Yeah." David sat down next to Sophie, who immediately leaned against him, still focused on her math problems. "How's the homework going, kiddo?" "Hard. I don't get fractions." "Let me see." David pulled the workbook over and together they worked through the problems. Simple stuff, really. But a few months ago, he wouldn't have been here to help. Wouldn't have known what Sophie was struggling with. Wouldn't have been present for this small, ordinary moment that turned out to be everything. Later that night, after Sophie was asleep, David and Jennifer sat together on the couch. This was new, this quiet companionship. For months they'd existed separately in the same house. Now they were learning to exist together again. "I got a job offer today," David said. "Consulting firm. Less money than before, but reasonable hours." They were clear about boundaries, work-life balance. "It's in the contract. Are you going to take it?" "I don't know. I wanted to talk to you first. It would mean being gone during the day, obviously. But I'd be home for dinner, home on weekends. I've been living off savings, but that won't last forever." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "I think you should take it. Not because we need the money immediately, but because you need something for yourself too. Just promise me it won't take over like before." "It won't. I'm different now." He took her hand, still careful with her healing bones. "I know you're still not sure about that. About whether this version of me is real or just temporary. I understand. But I'm going to keep showing you every day that this is who I am now." She looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw something shift in her expression. "I'm starting to believe that. It scares me to believe it because I don't want to be disappointed again. But I'm starting to." It wasn't a declaration of love or forgiveness. It was something more tentative, more fragile, but it was real. It was progress. Thank you, David said, for giving me this chance, for not giving up on us. I almost did, Jennifer admitted. Before the accident, I was thinking about leaving. I'd talked to a lawyer. I was so lonely, David, so tired of competing with your job for scraps of your attention. The words hurt, but they didn't surprise him. He'd known on some level how bad things had gotten. He just hadn't wanted to see it. I would have deserved that, he said. If you'd left, I would have deserved it. But then the accident happened and you changed. And I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to go back to how you were. But you haven't. I won't, David promised, because I know what's at stake now. I know what I almost lost. And nothing, absolutely nothing is worth losing you and Sophie. They sat together in the quiet house, the kind of peaceful quiet that only comes after storm and struggle. David thought about Robert and Jack, about the years it took them to rebuild, about how they'd almost lost everything but found a way back. He thought about the man in the waiting room that terrible night, the ghost version of himself who thought success meant sacrifice, who believed that love could be expressed in paychecks and promotions instead of presence and attention. That man was gone now. Or rather, David had chosen to leave him behind, and in his place was someone new. Someone who made mistakes and burned dinner and couldn't always fix everything. But someone who showed up. Someone who was learning that real strength wasn't about holding everything together alone. It was about being brave enough to change, humble enough to learn, human enough to admit when you'd lost your way. Sophie called out from her room, half asleep. Daddy, can you check my closet for monsters? I've got it, David said to Jennifer, kissing her forehead as he stood. He walked to Sophie's room, checked the closet thoroughly, pulled her blanket up to her chin and sat on the edge of her bed until she fell back asleep. These moments. These small, ordinary, precious moments. This was what mattered. This was what he'd almost lost while chasing things that didn't matter at all. When he came back to the living room, Jennifer had fallen asleep on the couch. David covered her with a blanket and sat down carefully beside her, not wanting to wake her but wanting to be close. He pulled out his phone and found Robert's number. He sent a simple text. Thank you for sharing your story with me. You changed my life. The response came a few minutes later. You changed your own life, son. I just held up a mirror. Proud of you. David looked around his living room, his wife sleeping peacefully beside him, his daughter safe in her bed, a job offer that would let him live a balanced life, therapy appointments on his calendar, date nights scheduled with Jennifer, parent-teacher conferences he actually planned to attend. It wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, still moments of doubt from Jennifer, still work to do. But it was real. It was authentic. It was a life he was actually living instead of running from. He thought about what Robert had said in the hospital. That strength wasn't about carrying everything alone. It was about being brave enough to change when change was needed, about being vulnerable enough to admit when you'd lost your way, about being human enough to ask for help. David had listened to a stranger's story on the worst night of his life.